Welcome to Surviving Bad. I'm your host, Peter Komendowski, and together we explore stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Our guest today, Kevin Tekaw, is a former U.S. attorney with a frontline perspective on the opioid crisis. Over 72,000 Americans are going to die from opioid and heroin overdoses in 2018. That is more fatalities in a year than the average number of American soldiers that perished during World War II. In fact, it is 8,000 more victims this year than the 64,000 that died in 2017. Americans are dying at an alarming rate. Most of these Americans are not homeless or destitute. They're not social misfits, losers, or even criminals. They are people like you and I, hardworking, with strong family values, good jobs, and caring families. And opioids have found a way to destroy their lives. Kevin is here to talk about how opioids have become a killer in Iowa and, importantly, in the workplace. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Peter.
You know, as a state's attorney, you did a lot of work fighting the opioid crisis. You still do it now. Tell me what's motivating you and what's going on in your life with this.
Yeah, I'm currently practicing at the Smith, Mills and Schrock Law Firm. We have an office here in Cedar Rapids, and we have an office in Des Moines and in Omaha. And as U.S. Attorney in the Northern District of Iowa, one of our priorities was getting out in front of this issue as it impacted Iowa, both on awareness and then prosecution, trying to go after the bad guys.
Now, we're not doing a good job. I mean, we know what's coming, and yet there seems to be a lot of inertia and weight, and we've found some particular hotspots in the fact that this has been a large part in Iowa, a white-collar sort of experience, this opioid crisis.
That's right. I mean, as your introduction mentioned, I mean, this is a public health crisis that most experts say is the worst the United States has ever experienced. The good news, if there is any in Iowa, the impact hasn't been as great as it has been in other parts of the country. What we see in Iowa are 5 counties that have been impacted the greatest. Here in eastern Iowa, Scott County, Dubuque County, Black Hawk, Lynn, and Johnson is where the most impact has. And if you look deeper into that, it is largely a white-collar crime where people that have been typically under medical supervision for pain, they're given painkillers, oxycodone and others, and then they slip into addiction, and that's led to some very bad results.
So what happens to an employer now that has somebody that might be impaired? What has changed in the workplace? Because you're not looking at a guy that's coming in drunk or somebody that's going out to get high. These are just average people taking what they think is a medicine that's going to help them.
Yeah, what we recommend for employers is to take a step back and really look at this problem just as they would any problem. And that all starts with a good policy. So they need to do a good policy review, making sure that they have identified what the conduct is, if it's a no-drug workplace, if they're going to do drug testing. But it all starts with a strong policy, and then a backstop with an attitude that they're going to, if they've identified a problem, they have in place medical assisted treatment or other counseling that will help that employer get back on their feet and again become a productive employee.
Now, what do we see as projected job losses in terms of productivity with things like opioids in the workplace?
Well, one statistic that I recently saw is that any employee that's under any kind of drug abuse in opioid, their cost to the employer can be up to 4 times as great to the employer if they're not identified. If they can get treatment and get back on their feet and become a productive employer, it's a great time saver, and it saves an employee that's been in the expense of being trained. So the loss of productivity follows right with that. So if they aren't identified and aren't given help, it can be as high as 20 to 30%.
You know, it's a sad case that we see something with such huge fatalities coming. You know, in watching the news, you see things like tropical storms coming, and everybody mobilizes, and thousands of public safety people go to save a handful of lives. And yet here we're losing tens of thousands. What do we see as the impact in Iowa? How many people died here in the last couple of years?
Well, one statistic that I know in Lynn County last year, 27 overdose deaths, 18 of those were attributed to opioid. Across Iowa, it's up near 200. But some of those statistics actually are probably underreported because of the way those are tracked through the emergency room. So we believe that the overdose and the deaths actually could be higher.
Yeah, I've heard some estimates of 300 to 400 because a lot of times people are doing opioids are also possibly drinking alcohol. And at some point in time, they might be looking for alternative forms of treatment as well, illegal substances.
That's right. Most people that have died of an overdose, you find that they're actually taking 2 or 3 other medications, whether it's alcohol, whether it's other drugs, meth, or even marijuana.
Well, we really want to get to the heart of how this is affecting and impacting, Iowans. Are there individuals you think, or things that individuals should know about opioids when they go to work and maybe know people that are impaired? Any suggestions you might give them?
Well, I think it all starts with when someone is identified with they believe they have pain, and it all comes back to that. And so, unfortunately, most people, most employees, most employers believe that painkillers are kind of the gold standard if you have pain, and that's not true. Not everyone needs the oxycodone or the prescribed medication. So there are studies that show there are many other less complicated or less expensive treatments that may be just as effective. In fact, some people are now advocating for genetic testing, and I know the Mayo Clinic is doing that, which actually shows people that are more susceptible to addiction. So it all starts with the individual. Everybody's different, but it shouldn't be an automatic, oh, here, have some painkillers, because that's really what's happened to too many people, in that they've become addicted, and then that started on the wrong course.
Well, we want to come back after the break and flush out some of these ideas, because the correlation between something that people look for help and how it may be damaging the potential for people, not only their lives, but what's happening in the workplace. When we return, we'll talk to Kevin about the challenges Iowa faces with the problem that affects both rural and urban Iowans, and how employers often face the worst of the problem. You don't want to miss this.
Many teenagers don't understand the dangers and effects of marijuana use. Now it's time for Just the Facts, ma'am. An IQ is a score determined from standardized tests to determine intelligence. An IQ of 100 puts the average person in the 50th percentile of intelligence. Regular marijuana use during teenage years can cause a long-term 8-point drop in IQ. A loss of 8 IQ points drops them to the 29th percentile. For more information, go to drugfreeiowa.org.
My dad thinks he can fix anything, but at least once a day, we catch him doing that with our modem. Like things would magically be faster if he could just get it high enough. He doesn't get that it's our phony internet. Looks like I'm gonna have to fix this one. Siri, get me faster internet.
Okay, calling Mediacom now. Drop the phony internet and get a real deal. Add Mediacom Internet 60 for just $14.99 a month for a year. Call today.
Watching your sister go through withdrawal is the last thing you expect to do. You hope she gets past it, but worry she'll relapse. The story of addiction is all too familiar, but you can change it.
That's 2 out of 3.
If you or someone you know is in recovery from addiction, share your story with the partnership at drugfree.org, because your story can change someone else's.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're talking about the opioid crisis in Iowa. Joining us is former U.S. Attorney Kevin Tekaw. There's a new killer in the workplace, opioids, and employers, whether they like it or not, are on the front line. Kevin is going to tell us just how much of a threat employers face in Iowa. Kevin, I want to point something out. I have heard people say that sometimes employers put their head in the sand on this issue because they really don't want to know the depth of the problem. Without putting you on the spot, is this a dangerous landscape to look at in terms of how employers have to deal with this?
Absolutely. Whether an employer already has a person on their staff or they're looking at a potential new employee, it's important that they recognize if that employee or potential employee has some kind of substance abuse issue. Opioid is certainly one that would give the most complicated issues. And that, again, starts with a solid drug testing program. It also starts with a solid drug program so that there's awareness of these issues and that supervisors and peers actually know the signs. So if you're an employer and you've had a good employee and suddenly you have a uptick in absenteeism change in attitude. Those could be an indicator, and you don't want to jump to conclusions, but you want to be able to have a supervisor that can actually ask the questions that gets to the heart of the problem, and then have a backstop with a treatment program that would get that employee the assistance that they needed so that they can get put back to a productive employee.
Now, what about somebody looking for a job? And let's say that they take opioids as a prescription, valid prescription for pain or for whatever. Do they have to disclose this to an employer if they are, or is this something that's sort of secret? I mean, when does this come out into the open?
Well, you mentioned, what's the difference between rural and city complications of this problem. And so for much of the state, and this tends to hit eastern Iowa more than western Iowa, Iowa is vastly under resourced for treatment. And so that really is a dilemma for somebody that's in a part of the state that does not have the opportunity for frontline treatment. And so it really depends on when they make that application, what's on the application. I mean, certainly if they provide false information or don't participate, that's grounds for never being hired or immediate termination. So it really starts with the individual. I'm a believer in we all work best when we work together. And there's really a hole in the Iowa approach currently because the amount of treatment facilities are really lacking, especially in the rural areas.
So for all practical purposes, a person doesn't have to disclose that they're taking opioids.
It really depends case by case.
Because I know I just read recently there was a case where somebody taking medical marijuana wanted to get a job in a drug-free workplace. And they weren't hired. They're going to sue them. And the court ruled for them in the first round, saying that they cannot discriminate against a person taking medical marijuana. And I presume that since that impairs the mind, as we know opioids do, that might be a similar sort of right. Is this sort of a Occam's razor? Are we a problem here that we're preaching one thing and then we're sort of stuck with another doctrine?
I mean, your employers that, especially if they're using heavy equipment or there's some OSHA type, they're going to get to the bottom of that through their screening employees. It's certainly recommended that they get to it with their screening. The case that you mentioned, I think you told me that it was on the East Coast. That'll be one to watch and really see if there's application beyond that. But typically an employer will ask those questions and the employee has to be honest.
Because we know there are a lot of stigmas for people that use drugs. And so what we don't want is good people that have fallen into this trap of addiction to now all of a sudden have a lot of doors closed in their lives. And yet that could be a distinct possibility in the workplace.
Right. So if I'm an employee and I've had a knee problem and I'm under opioids and I've used that for treatment, that's perfectly fine. It's just it's something that needs to be revealed so that the employer knows that may impact. So this is going to be discovered typically in a work exam. Many potential employees have to go through an exam. They have to pass that, and that's where it would be discovered, and it could be looked at in terms of does that make the person a good fit for that particular job in that company.
Well, thank you for sharing. When we come back from the break, we'll take a closer look at how substance abuse has challenged Iowa communities over the years and what's sort of happening now and where this is going. See you after the break.
You wouldn't walk through the halls of your school naked. Yet without thinking, many teens sext explicit photos of themselves to friends using cell phones, never thinking it'll go further. But once you hit send, you're exposed. You're out there in cyberspace for everyone to see. Sexting, it's dumb, it's dangerous, and it's against the law.
My mom thinks hashtags are something you eat with eggs. She legit has a meltdown every time her phone updates. Last week, she asked me to explain chat snap. So of course, she chose the absolute wrong internet provider, and now we have the slowest internet ever.
Escape Planet Slow and get a real deal. Add Mediacom Internet 60 for just $14.99 a month for a year. Call today.
After Kylie used coke, she stopped caring about school, friends, or who she had to steal from to get more of it. The story of addiction is all too familiar. but you can change it.
Sleeping in, Dad?
If you or someone you know is in recovery from addiction, share your story with the partnership at drugfree.org, because your story can change someone else's.
Welcome back to Surviving Bad. We're looking at the historical challenges Iowa has faced in substance abuse, some of the successes, and the threats that continue to hurt Iowans, especially in the workplace. Kevin, you know, we touched on this issue where people might get an intervention because if they're somehow addicted to opioids or any other drug, it might be caught if they operate heavy equipment, drive, things like that. But there are a whole lot of people that are taking medications like opioids that would never be tested in a situation like that. Clerical workers, administrative workers, executives. Do we see an increase in opioid use in those populations with that less of that potential for an intervention on a job?
Well, I think you have to take a step back when the opioid crisis started. If you go back in time 20, 30 years, doctors were reluctant to prescribe opioids to individuals, even if they were terminal. There were some dubious studies that weren't studies that the big pharmaceutical companies used to promote, and the next thing you know, it became regular course. The pain became known as the fifth vital symptom, so then people would rate their doctor by how their pain was managed. And so where before it was the exception, it became the norm. And opioids are a valid, important medical option for the right case. And so to get to the heart of your question, I think it's case by case. It's something that employers, citizens, we all need to be aware of, that if you're being treated for pain and you're being given a prescription, you need to be aware of the danger of addiction. I mean, anecdotally, you don't have to talk to too many people. If they go to a dentist, if they go to a doctor, they're given too many painkillers. And so those get left behind in the cabinet, and they can be misused by other family members. And so it's really more of an identification across our medical, our employer, and our citizen level of the dangers. It's a valid, important option, but it's not for everyone. It needs to be done carefully, and it needs to be monitored. And so if a person is a white-collar worker, a blue-collar worker, or a senior citizen, those are all issues that really need to be looked at carefully. And if they have a problem, if you're an employer, you need to be able to have a backstop and give medical-assisted treatment so you can put that person back to work and get them the help they need.
So now we have a crisis that kills a lot of people, over 70,000 people. In the last year alone, that death rate has increased by over 10%. So it's safe to say that in Iowa, that death rate is going to go up. What's wrong with the system? Why can't, even looking at it nationally, why can't we put a stop to this?
I think we perhaps have turned a corner. I mean, a couple measures that were taken in Iowa have been used effectively in other states where the pharmacy monitoring program has actually been strengthened, where before it was optional, now it's mandatory. Pharmaceuticals have to now report within a day, so that helps prevent people from pharmacy shopping. There's actually been, naloxone has been given as an option so that family members can actually get a prescription. Those are small steps. There's other steps that can be taken. Some legislators gave it half a loaf that was done last year, but there are other steps that can be taken, because really the danger is when people go from their prescription drugs then to the street drugs, and there are dangerous drugs like fentanyl that have been pumped into the system that are 50 times more potent, so people are hit with a drug that they didn't even know was coming. And so there's a lot of moving parts to this that need to be understood at all levels, whether it's the public health community, the medical community. Certainly employers need to get their hands around this so that we know what the dangers are. Because on the other side, I mean, this is a problem that hits all demographics. It doesn't matter how big your house is, how fat your wallet is. It's hitting rich people, people below average income, and we're not going to arrest our way out of this. Really what we need is education and better treatment and better understanding at the medical community so that we can do better going forward and so that it's prescribed appropriately.
Well, we know most of the people in Iowa are working. We have a low unemployment rate.
Right.
And we know we have a lot of people using dangerous substances, and opioids are near the top of that list, though alcohol is a big one too. What can employers do to help solve this problem? Because an employer has contact with virtually every addict in Iowa.
Well, I think the big thing is just get the basic understanding of the facts, and I'm a big believer in evidence-based solutions. There's plenty of organizations out there that can help them with an employer-assisted program, getting the good policies, getting the good testing, and the understanding what they can do on the education side, the prevention side, and the treatment side, along with giving the support underneath that so that we can move forward.
Should an employee be concerned about asking an employer for help if they think they have a problem or if they think someone else there has a problem?
I think that's all goes back to the policy, and good employers are going to allow for that, and that's really going to help them in their workplace. And
what we hear, though, there's a lot fewer of those good employers than there are overall.
There's certainly, there's certainly been problems where people that have found themselves in a situation, and that partly leads to the statistics that we've been talking about, where people get pushed in the wrong direction. And I think generally, there's a better understanding nationally. Again, we're fortunate that the depth of this problem hasn't hit us as hard as it has in states like Ohio, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and some of the bigger cities like St. Louis.
Thank you very much. After a short break, we'll invite Kevin to share his final comments and some advice that maybe could help save the life of someone you love. Stay tuned. Right through there.
You have to help her! Help her!
Hey, Sam, can you hear me? Looks like an overdose. Do you know what she was taking?
She doesn't do drugs. Her friends don't do drugs.
No, we're just trying to save your daughter's life. Any idea?
Go to the movies, hon. See you later.
Bye, Sam. Sam, wake up!
Sharing. I mean, I don't mind it when there's enough to go around. Toys with Charlie? Okay. My mint ice cream? Fine. Our slow internet with my whole family at the same time? That's pushing a man too far.
Get unlinked and get a real deal. Add Mediacom Internet 60 for just $14.99 a month for a year. Call today.
I thought texting friends on her cell phone was harmless.
But there she is, our daughter, topless for everyone to see.
I'm so embarrassed for her. I can't even imagine what she must be feeling. How did this happen?
What was she thinking?
Someone sent our teenage son a photo of a naked classmate. If he forwards it, it's a crime.
Our son committing a crime? I had no idea.
And he could be labeled a sex offender.
Tell your teen, sexting is a crime.
My dad thinks he can fix anything. But at least once a day, we catch him doing that with our modem. Like things would magically be faster if he could just get it high enough. He doesn't get that it's our phony internet. Looks like I'm gonna have to fix this one. Siri, get me faster internet.
Okay, calling Mediacom now.
Drop the phony internet and get a real deal. Add Mediacom Internet 60 for just $14.99 a month for a year. Call today.
Welcome back. Today we're tackling a big problem in Iowa, the opioid crisis. It has become a threat to jobs and businesses. Let's see what Kevin has to say about this dangerous state of affairs. Kevin, you're a dad. You've lived in Iowa most of your life. What can you share with people to give them some idea of what they can do to help improve on this?
Well, I think the first thing is what we've been talking about, just the awareness. And so when I was a U.S. attorney, when we did some community town halls like you do, I think we just need to raise the general awareness that this is a problem that hits all parts of our society. Famous people like Prince and Tom Petty that have all the resources in the world got addicted to painkillers because of injuries, and they died of an overdose.
And when we watch things like storms and they warn us of hurricanes, this is a storm,
right,
that we're facing every day.
So one demographic we haven't talked about are our youth. And some really tragic stories have happened from kids that have been played in high school or intercollegiate athletes or even professional athletes that get injured and then are given painkillers, like we talked about, given too much painkillers, and they become addicted. And I mean, Tyler Sash was a well-known Iowa football player. Unfortunately, was injured and got addicted to painkillers and died of an overdose. I mean,
Brett Favre admitted to using them for years.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go too far to hear athletes that have had this problem. And fortunately, Brett Favre got the help that he needed. But so I think there's just an awareness that, like we talked about, if you're whether you're a teenager that's been hurt in sports, or an individual that's been hurt on the job, or just in your home, you shouldn't expect to be put on oxycodone as your first step. You need to really get the right kind of evaluation, get the help you need, because it's not one size fits all. Some of us are more susceptible to addiction, but there are many other alternative courses that can be just as helpful and actually maybe more impactful than the prescribed drugs, because too many people have gone down that road, and then when the prescription runs out, they've turned to the street drugs. And that's really what we see different today than we saw maybe in the 60s when the first heroin crisis. Now, 3 or 4 out of 5 people that are addicted to opioids got their start on painkillers, and then when they turn to the street drug that's laced with unknown drugs like fentanyl.
And you've raised a couple of kids in Iowa that have been athletes, so you've probably kept a good eye on these things.
Absolutely.
To make
sure. And I think that the Iowa High School Athletic Association and the Girls Union are aware of this issue, and I think there's better information being put out to coaches and trainers so that we're in a better place than we were last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so this problem has been identified. So the more we can do to identify, get education out, and back them up with good information, I think we're in a better place. So as I said, I think we've turned the corner, but there's still plenty of work to be done.
Well, thank you for giving us some source of optimism that Iowa's moving in the right direction and giving us your help. And thank you for joining us today. And keep your eye on Mediacom MC22 for our next episode, where we explore Iowa stories of survival, hope, and inspiration. Only on Surviving Bad on Mediacom MC22, your local programming leader.
If you or someone you care about are looking for help with treatment or recovery, there is help out there. Please visit these sites.